Is anyone here familiar with First Nations history and whose traditional lands we're on here now? I'm not absolutely certain. I tried to find out today, and I think it's Lekwungen. So it's just to acknowledge that we're on First Nations lands, traditional lands here. And I would also like to read to you one of the Douglas treaties. It's not very long, but I think it's something that we start to pay a little bit more attention to. Know all men, we the chiefs of the family of Chuhason, acting for on behalf of our people, who being here present have individually and collectively ratified and confirmed this our act. Now know that we, who have signed our names and made our marks to this deed, on this first day of May, 1850, do consent to surrender entirely and forever to James Douglas, the agent of the Hudson's Bay Company in Vancouver Island. That is to say, for the governor, deputy governor, and committee of the same, the whole of the lands lying between the inlet and Bay of Souk Inlet and the snow-covered mountains in the interior of the island. The conditions of our understanding of this sale is that our village sites and enclosed fields are to be kept for our own use, for the use of our children and for those who may follow after us. And the land shall be properly surveyed hereafter. It is understood, however, that the land itself, with these small exceptions, becomes the entire property of the white people forever. It is also understood that we are at liberty to hunt over the unoccupied lands and to carry on our fisheries as formerly. We have received as payment £45, 10 shillings. In token thereof, we have signed our names and made our marks at Victoria on the first day of May, 1850. This is the law on the basis of which we make land use decisions. The only people that are totally excluded from the land use decisions that we make are the people who have the most right to those lands, in my opinion. We can no longer carry on without the participation and agreement of those First Nations, the people that were here first. The reason I read this treaty tonight is because I've been involved in land use issues for 2 decades. And really, during that whole time, we have never taken the time to base our land use decisions on the knowledge of these treaties. I find it amazing. This afternoon, I phoned the Souk Treaty Office to ask about the treaties and the comments I want to make this evening. And I asked specifically whether there was any agreement or asking for permission or anything from the municipalities and the Capital Regional District when land use decisions are made. Because if it's for a subdivision or something, it certainly is the total and complete exclusion of the people from their rights to hunt and fish in those lands. And that's a minimum on this treaty. I mean, nobody could read that stuff at that time, so I won't get into legitimacy of this treaty. But this is the law of the land as it stands. And a little story she told me is that there was a development on the Souk, on the basin, I think, or maybe it was Souk Harbor. Anyway, in the Souk area, in which a developer had found bones that were 650 years old on his site. And she told me that they had to buy back the burial ground from the developer so that it would not be covered by development. We just can't carry on in the way we are without really including First Nations. And I just wanted to start off with that because our campaign to protect a fairly large area in the last 2 decades has been largely successful. In 1990, for this slide up here, the only protected areas between Saanich Inlet and Souk Basin were Goldstream, Souk Mountain, and East Souk Park. approximately 2,000 hectares. The big issue at the time, and still is, habitat fragmentation, urbanization, and so on. And of course, logging, clear-cut logging, and more specifically, the clear-cut logging operation in the Greater Victoria Water District lands. After 15, 20 years, the three parks are now basically hooked up to a system of protected areas. The blue is the Souk Lake watershed, and now to the west of the Souk Lake watershed is the Leach watershed, which is nearly 1,000 hectares, or 10,000 hectares, about the same size as the Souk Lake watershed. So the completely protected area now is around 35,000 hectares. So it's gone from 2,000 to 35,000. And in that area are completely protected watersheds. They're small, mind you. The Gold Stream, Niagara Creek just to the northeast, the top half of Veach, there's the Wa in here, and then AM Creek is this one here. It's a little special. Camp Thunderbird is in AM Creek. Then there's the Charters River watershed and a few small ones north of Charters River. If you go down the east side of Vancouver Island, or up the east side of Vancouver Island, from here to the very north end of Vancouver Island, there is not one completely protected watershed. Not one. We have a bunch of small ones here now. If you go on the west side, you can go at least to Port Renfrew and quite a stretch after Port Renfrew. Not one completely protected watershed neither. So the campaign that started in 1990 to protect these areas and stop the logging operation, well, first of all, to stop the logging operation in the Greater Victoria Water District has been an interesting and eventful campaign. This is the first map, and I should say something about terminology here. This map is called Greater Victoria Greenbelt. We're the C2C Greenbelt Society. There's the Souk Hills campaign, and then there's a C2C Green Blue Belt campaign. They're all different names for the same campaign. It just so happened that Western Canada Wilderness Committee, which really carried the ball, had the organizational ability and the funds to put out the newspapers and so on, named their campaign the Souk Hills campaign, just to distinguish themselves from other organizations, which is understandable. It was fortunate to run across the 1 to 50,000 scale maps in the early 90s. What was interesting about those maps is that the land ownership and land designations, whether it's tree farm license or other licenses, the water district lands and crown lands were designated on those maps. The modern maps, all that's gone. We would not have been able to find out who owned what and whether or not the campaign was feasible. It was simply this map. So I just drew the watershed boundaries on the map and designated the various ownerships. 1 is a Greater Victoria Water District, 2 is already protected lands, 3 was Crown lands, 4 is Camp Thunderbird, and 5 are various private lands. And if you measure the area, and we included East Souk Park because we considered it part of it across the Souk basin. So about 70% of the area was already protected. It was already owned by the members of our communities. This is the first newspaper that Western Canada Wilderness Committee put out in 1992. The picture on the right here, Judge Creek, is one of the creeks, the main creek, one of the main creeks. There's only 2 of them, basically. That comes in to the north end. Comes into the north end of the Souk Reservoir. And it's the kind of logging that was going on was outrageous. There was very little. There was a report at that time called the Terrasol Report. And in that report, certain recommendations are made regarding land use management practices. And Mr. Carr, who was the head of the Terrasol Report, was asked in a public meeting why there was no consideration of how much land had been roaded, ditched, compacted, and so on regarding the Greater Victoria Water District lands. And his response was, it wasn't in the terms of reference. And we thought, well, that's rather interesting. So that was a lesson well learned at that time. Pay attention to the terms of reference. And it was really unbelievable that we were having a technical land use review, an area, and we measured it, the size of a Esquimalt had been turned into gravel, ditches, and compacted soil, and that was not part of the technical land use review. But there was a positive thing that came out of the technical land use review, and that is that the lands, that they made suggestions that the water district acquire all the lands that our water supply comes from. And so recently, just a few years ago, the water district did buy the Leech River watershed. It hasn't seen much logging lately. In one of the remote sensing pictures I have of the Leech River watershed, it's one of the worst watersheds in terms of condition on southern Vancouver Island, but it's in the recovery mode. So hopefully in the future, when it is used for water supply, the water will be good enough to drink out of it. One of the reasons the campaign became successful over time is the willingness of experts to speak out. And there are three here. It's Michael Feller from the University of British Columbia, and a marvelous lady, Chris Pilu, and of course, Richard Hebda. I wish I could blow this up, because Chris Pilu's quote is the telling one. And she was willing to speak up and speak clearly. And she says in her quote that logging does affect biodiversity and the ecology of the place. And at that time, it was difficult to find experts to come and speak on these issues. Either many were working for government or for the logging companies, and even in academia, they were reluctant to speak up. But Chris was so clear. Clear cutting causes two kinds of ecological damage, one long-lasting and the other permanent. The long-lasting damage is to the soil, the permanent damage is to the biological genetic diversity. And that was news during those days. Many of the board were not willing to accept the perspective that was being put forward by the segments of the community which wanted to see the logging operation stopped in the Greater Victoria Water District. One clear cut was at the north end of Souk Lake, nearly 1 square kilometer. That's amazing. And yet, the water district maintained that logging had no effect on water quality. The other thing that came out of the technical land use review is the water district did not determine, or didn't even try to determine, if logging affected water quality. Some of the stuff that was going on, when I say it now, it's unbelievable, but that is the case. In 1990, over 2,000 loaded logging trucks, which is 45 kilometers long of logging trucks, came out of the water district lands. The next paper put out was in the winter, and this is by Western Canada Wilderness Committee again, in the winter of '95. One of the most magical places is the upper Niagara Creek watershed. Wolves pass through there. There's bear, cougar, wolverine. All the major mammals that were here in the past are still in this area. And that's 15 kilometers from where we're sitting. Regarding wolves, my friends discovered a lake-hold trap and a young wolf caught in the trap. This was in the Water District lands some years ago. Hopefully that's not occurring any longer. This picture here, this is also the old growth in Niagara Creek watershed. Some of the trees are immense, and one of the old vets came down, is this one here, in some years ago, so I had a chance to measure the height. That tree was 235 feet high. I don't deal in meters yet, so I don't know how high that is. It's pretty high. That's approximately a 23-story building. One of the issues in the campaign was always to make a connection between our habits and those forests out there. Since we receive our drinking water from those forests, one way to modify, when our behavior is modified for the purposes of water conservation, we make less demands on that area out there. So we had an expert from the federal government in the United States come up, and during the Wildlands Conference actually, and the first thing he said to me was, why have you guys ever got high water pressure? All you have to do is turn the water pressure down a wee bit. You're wasting an awful lot of water. So simple things, the services we get from the water is what counts, not necessarily how much we waste. So that was a lesson that we tried to get people to pay attention to, and especially the water district. There was no consideration for water conservation at that time. On the left-hand side there, the two people were walking around down a logging road beside Veach Creek, and it's a wonderful place. One of the special aspects of that creek and that particular logging road is you can't hear, see, smell the city. No urban sounds whatsoever, and that's also very close to town here. That's another view of Veach Creek watershed on the right there. This picture here, and that stump that I'm sitting on, I counted the rings, was 350 years. A stump, it doesn't look very big, but it was like this. And that was the last clear cut that the Greater Victoria Water District did. By this time, the terminology had been changed, and that was by the Water District Forester called a treatment unit. They were no longer clear cuts, they were treatment units. But this is 1995, and in 1995 was the year that we won the court case. And things after that court case changed. Just regarding governance, and I'll get back to the court case in a second. Regarding governance, one of the reasons that we were successful in the campaign in the protection of the area was there was a coincidence of interests from some of the municipalities and the environmental community. The Greater Victoria Water District was run by Oak Bay, Victoria, Esquimalt, and Saanich. Those four communities owned and were legislated to run the Greater Victoria Water District. All the other communities bought their water from the four core communities. And under some circumstances, they were not very pleased with the arrangement and the fees that they had to pay for water. So they also were not happy with the Greater Victoria Water District, and that'll come out in a few minutes. The court case was between Rainer Zimmerman, Dr. Janet Ray, who happens to be here tonight, Ruth Clay, Susan Watt, Ado Nyland, who's a forester, Dr. Joan Rosenberg, Western Canada Wilderness Committee, and the Sierra Club of Western Canada. The question which we asked the courts was, does the defendant, the Greater Victoria Water District, have the authority to carry on a commercial logging operation? We had several meetings with Sierra Legal, I think that's Ecojustice now, in 1994. And according to, it was Mark Haddock and Greg McDade with Sierra Legal at that time, we didn't have standing, or we couldn't challenge the Greater Victoria Water District in court. That was rather disappointing because one of the astute observers of the local political scene and the man who started the campaign to bring attention to the Greater Victoria Water District was Mehdi Najari. And Mehdi Najari and Jim Gillespie, who was a wonderful logger. He's the brother of Bob Gillespie, who was on the water board. And Jim had an axe to grind with the provincial government. They took his logging license away during the Bonner years, and he took his logging equipment, drove it up on the lawn of the legislature. So he knew all the stories, ins and outs, had so many connections. And because of what had been done to him by the government, he sided with the environmentalists. And it was just a treat to have Jim Gillespie on our side. So anyway, it was Jim and Mehdi. They were just, it's illegal, what they're doing is illegal, we've got to be able to do something. So we get the lawyers together, and no, we haven't got any standing. Well, we still kept at it. A friend of mine who happens to be a lawyer from the mainland was over for supper one night, and he's a really nice guy who does a lot of pro bono work, and I was reluctant to ask him, so we had our supper, had a few glasses of wine, and I couldn't help it. I said, "Hey, John, can you have a look at the Greater Victoria Water District Act?" And sure, and with a bottle of beer and some time, it didn't matter. He read the objects and powers of the Water District Act, and he says, "They can't carry on a commercial logging operation." So I said, well, we talked to Greg McDigg and Mark Haddock, and they said no. And he said, well, Greg articled with me. Call Greg up and tell him if they prepare the case, I'll argue it in court. And that's how we got that case to court. And the court finally said, at the end of it all, this is the judge, Supreme Court of British Columbia in 1994, January 26, 94. I find that the commercial logging of the lands by the defendant is ultra vires the statute, even applying the concept in its broadest scope. Therefore, the question must be answered in the negative. Any further relief, anyway, can't carry on a commercial logging operation. Since the 1940s until this is 94, 50 years approximately, half a century, the Greater Victoria Water District had been carrying on an illegal logging operation. With that change, the attitude of the board changed somewhat too. They paid a little bit more attention to the innumerable number of people and organizations which had been making presentations to them for about 5 years. So this is a 5-year period that I've just covered. Now getting back to the governance, the 4 core communities were, as I said, and then the others, which were, it's a different map. Anyway, it's North Saanich, Sydney, Souk, Metchosin, Colwood, Langford, etc. Were buying the water from those 4 core communities. And that is one of the reasons that we were successful in, I believe, the Perry Commission. The Perry Commission was put in place by the provincial government at the time to look at governance and had a huge number of representations to see that the surplus lands of the water district, which were surplus lands, by the way, are the green ones on the map here, which are not used for water supply. That is off-catchment lands. And the Perry report came out and basically rearranged the water district governance. It was changed to Capital Regional District water and protected the Souk Hills. So number 5, number 6, and number 7 on this map here, which are surplus water district lands, were put into park status, and that's about 5,000 hectares. When that happened, at the same time, there was quite a large effort at the protection of the Gowland Range by a completely different group of individuals and organizations worked on that, and they were successful. So in 94, 95, the Gowland Range was protected. So the sense that we had of the green belt going from Saanich Inlet down to Souk Basin was coming into place. The most difficult chore, of course, was number 8 area. There was about 5,000 acres of land owned by Seraphin. Now, the organizations and individuals involved in this campaign had, of course, no money whatsoever. So where was the funds going to come from? And the owner of those lands wanted $5 million for 3,000 acres. That's what it was, I'm pretty sure. Well, in 97, the Land Conservancy of British Columbia was formed. And this was also just a wonderful happenstance and coincidence. And Bill Turner, some years before, when he was approached about the C2C Greenbelt area, he understood the concept immediately and recognized the challenges. And TLC made the original arrangements for the acquisition of those lands. So it was just wonderful that worked out. The other acquisition part, that is the buying of private lands, occurred at the mouth of AM Creek, and the Society for Protection of AM Creek was formed in 95, 96, something like that. And there was a proposal to put 93 housing units on the floodplain of AM Creek, right at the mouth of the creek, and it was supposed to be for seniors housing. That didn't fly, and And those lands were bought by HAT, Habitat Acquisition Trust, some monies from C2C, and TLC. Well, this was a little before TLC. Anyways, those lands were eventually acquired, 12 hectares for $800,000. So the Greenbelt was falling into place. The period from 95 to 2000 was a time for acquisition of lands. And much of the rest of those lands were bought and acquired and protected during that time. So we ended up with approximately, and because the commercial logging operation stopped in the Water District lands and the acquisition of Leech River rather, we now have approximately 35,000 hectares of lands protected between Saanich Inlet, Souk Basin, and then up to the Water District. So in 2000, it was 2,000 hectares, and now it's 35,000 hectares, containing the only protected watersheds on the whole east side of Vancouver Island. So that campaign was quite successful. One of the things that accomplished was we had a large area protected for biodiversity, 35,000 hectares so far in the Capital Regional District. In 1974, the Agricultural Land Reserve was put in place. So we have 16,000 hectares still now in agricultural lands. And we have our drinking watersheds protected. So when you consider what's reflected in the landscape, what do we have in the landscape necessary for survival? Biodiversity protection, watershed, drinking watersheds protected, and agricultural lands protected. It's a most amazing combination. Not many places have the amount of lands protected that we have here. It didn't happen by accident. I would venture to suggest that the NDP government in 1974 lost the next election because they did some of those things. I'm not a member of any political party, but the sacrifices made then for the protection of the Agricultural Land Reserve in the province of British Columbia was immense and will have long-time consequences, and it's fantastic. So with those three things reflected in our landscape, it's incumbent on us to pay a little more attention to the decisions being made municipally and in the Capital Regional District in relation to land use. Several things happened in the beginning of 2000, well, 2005, 2006. There was not Terrasol, it was, I forgot the name of the company, that was to review the Malahat and see what kind of expansions were necessary, possible in the Malahat. At the same time, there was a suggestion by the Capital Regional District to put water into lands adjacent to, just northwest of Souk, adjacent to the Western Forest Products lands. So we have water expansion, talk of highway expansion, and the Western Forest Products. That was in 2006. When in 2007, January 31st, 2007, the provincial government came out and made the announcement on Vancouver Island, 28,000 hectares of private lands had been released from TFL 6, 19, and 25. It was obvious that something was up. Something was going on in the background which no one had made connections with. These were in-camera decisions just plopped down without no foreknowledge of the Capital Regional District. The consequences of those deletions, and in the Capital Regional District, the TFL deletion from TFL 25 was over 12,000 hectares. That's 5 times the size of the city of Victoria. Not only was it a large area, but it was spread out over 50 kilometers. So when it comes to the red and green is TFL 25. The red is what was allowed out of TFL 25 on January 31st, 2007. From here to here is about 50 kilometers, totally fragmented. Now, in terms of the ability to plan for these lands, it becomes very difficult. Mainly because it's fragmented private land, public land surrounding it in places, and no foreknowledge of the people responsible to do the planning. What was troubling was that the Capital Regional District made no response to these TFL deletions. This happened in January 31st, 2007, not until in a public meeting for the Capital Regional District Board in November 2007, where somebody from the audience made a presentation and said, why don't you send a letter, speaking to the board, the CRD board, why don't you send a letter to the provincial government and tell them that you're downloading an awful lot of trouble on us? It took nearly a year for the Capital Regional District Board to respond to what was happening. So one would wonder, are they actually happy about these TFL deletions because it puts a whole whack of private property on the real estate market? Why did they not respond? It's a real troubling question. The Western Forest Products, after those TFL deletions, made the largest subdivision application in CRD history. 1,400 hectares to be turned into 2-acre lots, spread out over 20 kilometers. Now that's what the CRD planners have to deal with. That, as a result of that application, we hired a lawyer and tried to stay on top of Mr. Wiley, who's the provincial approving officer, to make sure that the whole process was followed properly, and insisted on, and he received hundreds of emails, insisted on a public hearing so that the public can have input on this immense, the largest subdivision application in CRD history. Well, as it turns out, Mr. Wiley wrote to Western Forest Products and said, you are not fulfilling the necessary steps to get the subdivision application. We'd gone through a lot, all the organizations. Dogwood Initiative, in this case, was the leading, they had the ability and the individuals hired. They were wonderful in the work done in relation to this. Since the Western Forest Products did not try to fulfill the obligations of that application, one of the things that you can consider is that they were not serious about making that application concrete. So why would Western Forest Products go to the trouble of making this huge subdivision application and not follow through on it? I would venture to guess that it was because they wanted to increase the profile of those lands and increase the market value. The forest companies, Western Forest Products and Tree Farm License and Timber West, were turning into real estate sellers. They call it highest and best use. Western Forest Products in the offering, the public offering by Colliers, stated that the highest and best use for these lands is as real estate and the subsequent urban sprawl that we would get from that kind of a dispersal of land. It's really amazing that the way this works, and it's sometimes just about having to read the tea leaves in order to understand what's going on. With Anders Ilke's application, which is in this area here, just those little tiny red dots there, he also went through a long and convoluted process, and it demanded an immense effort from the environmental organizations and the public here to ensure that he did not get the speculative nature of his deal there. Many of the valuations of that scenario of 260 some odd cabins spread out over 17 kilometers along the Juan de Fuca Trail were that it wasn't financially feasible. It's highly unlikely that he'd make any money doing it the way he was going to do it. He went to a little extra effort than Western Forest Products did. But I also wonder what was the function of that rezoning application. And now there's talk of Anders Ilke being traded lands that the CRD bought at Jordan River for his subdivision rezoning request way further to the west. And let's be clear, and I think most people know, there is no habitation, hardly any, between Jordan River and Port Renfrew. So this development was in the middle of nowhere with no facilities and the necessary other roads, firefighting and all that kind of stuff. So the lands that have been released as a result of TFL 25 deserved a lot of attention. We, C2C, also initiated in order to get the attention necessary to this TFL deletion, we approached the Environmental Law Clinic here at the university and to look into those TFL deletions. We wanted to take them to court. We wanted to challenge those deletions, or the provincial government, because it was really a provincial government, and the Western Forest Products was just the recipients of provincial government largesse. In other cases where TFLs have been, or where private lands have been taken out of TFLs, millions, and tens of millions of dollars have been paid by those companies to take their private lands out of the TFLs. When we consider what the TFLs were all about, especially on southern Vancouver Island, which is the largest contiguous piece of most productive forest land in British Columbia. So Western Forest Products, people and companies that came before, had the right to log that fine forest. They had exclusive right, and with that exclusive right, any company can go to a bank and get a considerable amount of money. So not only did it give them the exclusive right for that magnificent forest, but it also gave them access to capital. And what do we get as a result? The forest is gone, and the logging companies have turned into real estate dealers. We've been shortchanged, and there's been very little government response for that shortchange. So the good story today is the campaigns that happened in the 90s, and I suppose it's partly a good story today, is that the efforts put together by a Forest Action Network and Dogwood Initiative, C2C Greenbelt Society, the Environmental Law Clinic, and many other organizations to attempt to hold the politicians accountable for the decisions they've made. So our great challenge here now is this piece of land here. That's 130,000 hectares. It's the Wanafuka, it's called now the Rural Resource Lands of the Wanafuka electoral area. This 130,000 hectares is forest land, primarily, has been logged and sometimes more than once, but it has 160 people living on it. 160. 67 landowners, I guess 68 now, with Ender's Ilkay's inclusion. It's a huge forest land. The development pressures that will come from these forest companies who are turning into real estate agents or real estate sellers will be the challenge here. And the only way, well, one of the ways certainly that we can challenge the land decisions in relation to this is to ensure that we have a strong regional growth strategy. And the decision makers are our politicians, in our municipal politicians and the politicians in the Capital Regional District. And that's our challenge for the future. Thanks very much.